Welcome to Mission Oriented, a VeteranCrowd podcast that showcases veteran talent from both the private and public sectors. Their impact is everywhere. We are here to uncover it. Here's your host, Bob Louthan.
Welcome, everybody. This is your host, Bob Louthan. My guest today is no stranger to the Mission Oriented podcast. He was my guest on January the 29th, 2021 on episode number 64. So 114 episodes later, here we are. Robert Williscroft is back with us again. Thank you so much for being a guest on the Mission Oriented podcast. Welcome back.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
We're going to talk about a lot of things today. I'm going to quickly kind of run through your resume and history, but we'll dig into it in the course of the conversation. But, retired submariner, a deep sea saturation diver, scientist, author of many, many books at this point, 22 months underwater, 3 years in the Arctic ice pack, a year at the South Pole. You've packed a lot into your years there, Robert. I've got to commend you on that.
Yeah, the time was well spent, and what was really cool is that I didn't have to pay for any of it. You guys, taxpayers, paid for all of my life of adventure.
All of this fun. Well, we're going to dive into that. You have just recently completed a book, another in the Mac McDowell series, Operation Whiteout. We're going to talk about that. I've been listening to Operation Whiteout on Audible. It's available on Amazon and now on Audible. Very interesting story. Mac McDowell's getting in trouble again, right?
Well, you could say that.
You could say that.
He has a propensity for getting into trouble.
Well, I've got a few questions about the book, but first, one of the things you wanted to do, there's a little disclaimer in the front of the book that you wanted to share. And I thought we'd start with that. And then we're going to dig into a few things, some questions I've got about the book. And then I'm going to take you in a totally different direction because I've got some current events and I just want to hear your thoughts on them.
Okay, this is from the diary of TOG team member, Petty Officer Second Class, Lodek Slowski. Everybody calls him Ski, of course. This is following the successful completion of Operation Whiteout by the USS Toothus. So this is in Ski's own words. Yes, on the sub I was on, we did do some of the stuff we did, and we didn't do some of the other stuff we did because if we did do it, it was secret, and we didn't really do it, even though we did, but not really. Those medals me and my shipmates got that we didn't get for doing what we didn't do that we did, I really got those, except not. But yeah, that's because we never went where we were. So we weren't there where we were. And even though we weren't where we were, we did do the stuff we didn't do while we weren't there, not doing it. As for the boat we were on, that we didn't go there on it, I didn't do all the stuff we did while not doing that either. Apparently, I'm not supposed to even mention the USS Toothus SSNR-2 because I guess I'm not allowed to refer to the Toothus for security reasons, so I won't do that. Mention the USS Toothus SSNR-2, I mean. The other stuff, it's okay for me not to mention that too. So the bottom line is that while we weren't on the USS Toothus SSNR-2, which I'm not going to mention, not doing what we were doing where we weren't, we didn't do that either. I hope this clarifies things for you.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about all these things that you didn't do, that you were doing that you didn't do. All right. Oh my God, that's hilarious. So Mac McDowell is recovering from his last episode, gets called back into action. Can you kind of set that up? And then I've got to just ask a few questions. I'm not going to give away the plot, but maybe you can set it up for everybody for Operation Whiteout.
In Operation Arctic Sting, right at the end, Mac was and his girlfriend were forced off of a high bridge purposefully by a Soviet cell. A couple of semis pushed him and his Corvette off. She was killed. he survived, and a character that appears in Operation Whiteout and Operation Arctic Sting and in Operation Icebreaker. The orca Borisco locates back on the bottom of the Thames River in New London and brings him to safety, and he survives. And he ends up getting selected for the nuclear power training in order to become commanding officer in the future of a nuclear submarine. And he does his training from his hospital bed and manages to be at the head of his class. So he's a bright guy who's really motivated. And he gets set up then as the executive officer, the second in command of the USS Toothus. And the story picks up at that point.
Now, I got to ask you about Borisco. This is the world's most well-traveled orca, I've got to tell you. And I'm just going to jump right to my question. Where did that come from? And is there some real life experience with regards to, I mean, this orca follows Mac McDowell everywhere.
And an orca is big. I don't think people really understand how big an orca is. They're 30 feet long. They weigh a whole bunch of tons. They eat 600 pounds of shrimp a day, or whatever else they can get into their mouths. And they're very, very human friendly. I first ran into orcas in Puget Sound, and we knew there was a pod of orcas out there having fun. Puget Sound's a good place for an orca to be because there's a lot of fish, and there's nobody out there hunting them or anything. So they're smart, they know that, and they like to spend time in Puget Sound. So we went out in small craft. I'm talking really small craft, canoes, paddled, no motors, and moved right into the pod. And these guys were coming up and checking us out and getting their eyes up above the gunnel. And so what the heck, I got in the water with them. And it turns out that you can bond with an orca. And I describe this in several places in the books, but an orca loves to have his tongue scratched. And if you reach into his mouth, 6-foot mouth, and scratch his tongue, you've bonded. And if you take the time to leave your hand in there for about 30 seconds or so, you're bonded for life. He will protect you. He will protect you from things in the water. It's an amazing thing, and this is for real. And I build that into the story.
So that's the source of Borisco, but Borisco follows the submarine from Connecticut to the South Atlantic into the Antarctic. Is that correct? Now, could that really happen?
Oh yeah. In fact, orcas have been tagged in the North Atlantic and have been found in the South Pacific.
Okay. So, but is there any direct experience with an orca following a submarine? I'm just curious about that. This is like the Toothus is mascot, is the only way I can describe it.
The Toothus is unique in that it has lockout capabilities, kind of like the Jimmy Carter, but at depth rather than shallow, the way the Jimmy Carter was set up. And this gives divers the opportunity to interact with whatever is out there. And it seemed reasonable, based upon my experience with orcas, that if the orca bonded with several of the divers and was able to recognize them, and orcas can recognize colors and can recognize numbers. If you've got 3 guys with 3 different numbers, it will know who is who. It stands to reason that the orca will try to maintain that contact. And I set the stories up in such a way that it was possible, even plausible, for Borisco to be part of the action. And
That's
then
interesting.
Then I gave him something to do.
You gave him something to do. That's right. Well, let's talk about deep sea saturation diving, because there were some elements in the book that kind of gave some insight into that. This is diving going on at depths up to 1,000 feet, special mixtures of gases, and extremely long decompression times. Can you just kind of talk through a little bit of the science behind all of this?
Well, uh, at the surface, the air we breathe is 21% oxygen and roughly 79% nitrogen. It's got a few trace gases, a little bit of carbon dioxide and others, but mostly those two. And our bodies are set up to breathe a partial pressure of oxygen of 21%. Now, if you take a scuba tank and go down to say 100 feet, that's roughly 3 atmospheres. The air that you're breathing is at 3 atmospheres, which means that you're breathing a partial pressure of oxygen of about 63%. A lot more oxygen than your body would normally get with each breath. Now, at 100 feet, at 3 atmospheres, oxygen isn't toxic, but you get down to about 150, 175 feet, somewhere in there, oxygen starts being toxic. And some people are very susceptible to it, but you'll go into convulsions and eventually die. Hand in hand with this, nitrogen, the other component in what we breathe, you're breathing a larger partial pressure of nitrogen as you go deeper. And at about 100, about the same depth as oxygen, nitrogen becomes narcotic.
Right.
It's called the rapture of the deep and other fanciful names. But the bottom line is that if you don't do something about it, you're gonna take off your mask and dance into heaven or hell. Mm. So deeper diving, you remove as much of the oxygen as you can to get it down to about a partial pressure of 0.2%, 20%, and you replace the nitrogen with something that isn't narcotic, like helium. And when you get down to 1,000 feet, which is roughly 30 atmospheres, the percentage of oxygen, the actual physical percentage of oxygen is well below 1%. Mm-hmm. But the partial pressure of oxygen that you're breathing is still the same.
Right. And so this is the science behind deep sea diving. And how long does it take to decompress once you've been working at depths like that?
A rule of thumb is roughly 1 day for every 100 feet of saturation, roughly. So if you're at 1,000 feet, it'll take you about 10 days to decompress.
And that was the thing that just struck me in Operation Whiteout, talking about how long these guys were going to be in the decompression chamber after they had done one of these dives. I was just like, gosh, hope you brought some cards or something.
Yeah, you do learn to occupy yourself, and the guys get to know each other very well.
Yeah, it's really pretty confined space and high pressure.
And at depth, because of the pressure of the oxygen, the pressure of the gas that you're breathing, and the presence of helium, your voice is so distorted that face to face, you can't understand one another. It has to go through a descrambler into earbuds.
It's very interesting, all of that. And a lot of that is depicted in the book. Couple of other things. I mean, you've got the communist Chinese, you got Soviet spies, you've got Brits involved in this thing. Again, I got to ask you a question. Is any direct life experience in subliminally, as in your prelude, they're doing the things that we said we did that didn't happen, that we can't talk about, that we did?
Well, the story Operation Whiteout takes place right after the Falklands War. And because of my background in submarines and in intelligence, I am aware of which nations have what kind of submarines and who's building the various kinds of submarines. And I know that the Germans built a couple of really fine diesel submarines for the Argentinians. And the Argentinians made good use of them during the Falkland War. And it's a very short step beyond that to have the Argentinians ask the Germans if they can't maybe make a Stirling cycle engine submarine, an AIP submarine, air independent propulsion submarine, that allows them to do things that an old diesel couldn't do. And the Germans, of course, have that full capability. They've made them for a lot of people. So did the Argentines really have one? Well, probably.
Okay. One more question, and then we're going to shift gears after the break. Leopard seal.
Oh my!
Did you ever encounter leopard seals? And is that these things are evidently pretty far at the high end of the food chain in the Arctic.
Yeah, there's only one thing above leopard seals in the Antarctic, and that's orcas. Leopard seals are vicious by nature. They attack first and ask questions later. But in doing my research, I came across a biologist, a oceanographic biologist, who had learned to make friends with leopard seals. And she was underwater, and a leopard seal had made a kill, and it actually brought the kill to her to share it with her. So
well, fortunately, they like penguins more than they like people, I think, is what I would take away from that. Hey, you're listening to the Mission Oriented Podcast on the VeteranCrowd Network. The Mission Oriented Podcast is sponsored by Transact Capital Partners. Transact Capital Partners is a full-service mergers and acquisitions advisory firm specializing in the confidential sale and acquisition of privately owned mid-tier businesses. At Transact Capital Partners, we believe that our veterans continue to lead impactful lives as civic and business leaders. Their leadership and management skills, hardened in the crucible of the military, are key drivers of success. Veterans are mentally tough team players and creative problem solvers imbued with a heightened sense of ethics and personal accountability. Transact Capital Partners is committed to supporting veteran business owners throughout the life of their companies, building professional relationships and networks, advising on capital formation, mergers, and acquisitions. Contact the veterans on our team, Matt Kane, Ross Harris, and Bob Louthen at transactcapital.com. Welcome back. You're listening to the Mission Oriented Podcast on the VeteranCrowd Network. My guest is Robert Williscroft. I'm going to shift gears now. First, folks, I'll encourage you to go on Amazon and read the book Operation Whiteout with Mac McDowell. Check into the series and support Robert Williscroft, the author here. We'll put links to all of the ways that you can get in touch with Robert and Amazon on the show notes. Let me shift gears with you for a second. You're a scientist. You spent time in the Arctic. You spent time at the South Pole. I want to talk a little bit about global warming now. Can we do that?
Sure, we can.
Climate change, or whatever the terminology is. My understanding is that the Antarctic sea ice is expanding pretty rapidly right now. Have you got any up-to-date stuff you can share and opinions on global warming? I've seen some interesting things. And again, global warming depends on when you measure it from, right? It's actually down 5 degrees centigrade if you go back 700 years, whatever. So I'm not a climate science denier, but I am certainly a skeptic.
Well, let's step back and examine the larger picture for a second. Global climate change has been part of Earth's history as far back as we're able to measure. There are major cycles that are on the 450,000 year rate, and then there are 150,000 year cycles. And if you look at a chart of glaciation through the history of the Earth, you'll see that there has been a series of glaciations and warming periods. And we are right now, and have been in yours and my lifetime, at the cusp of the latest warming period. And we're about to jump into a glaciation period, and it's going to be a doozy. We may not see it. Our grandkids probably will. They'll begin to see some real changes in climate. Human beings don't affect the climate, period. The sun drives the whole global climate thing. And the way it works is this: there are four major solar cycles. One is about 11 years. Most people have heard of that one. They call it the sunspot cycle. But there's another cycle at about 90 years, another one at about 150 years, and one at about 1,500 years. And when these coincide, which they do roughly every 150,000 years, you either get lots of warming or lots of cooling. Now, there really is a relationship between carbon dioxide and global temperature, but it is not the one that you hear in the news and in the talking heads. A couple of my colleagues, after I left the South Pole and came back to the States, did some deep core drilling on the Greenland ice pack going back about 750,000 years. And what they were able to determine, and this is part of the whole basis for climate studies, is that yes, there is a correlation between carbon dioxide levels and temperature, but after the temperature has gone up, carbon dioxide goes up. After the temperature has gone down, carbon dioxide goes down. The reason is pretty simple. The ocean is a big sink. The sun warms the atmosphere up, and the atmosphere gets warm. It starts warming the oceans, and the ocean gives up its store of carbon dioxide. And as the sun begins to cool, the planet cools, the atmosphere cools, the oceans cool, and they start sucking up carbon dioxide. That's the whole thing. Humans simply have nothing to do with it.
So when you talk about glaciation and you talk about a big one that's maybe our grandchildren will see, what does it look like? I mean, how far south is the ice moving? In
into
North
the
America.
United States, major ice sheets coming down, probably into the mid latitudes of the United States, Oklahoma, that kind of thing. But that's
How long would that take?
Thousands of years.
Okay.
Very, very slow. The whole cycle's 100.
Same thing in Europe?
Same thing. It'll happen faster in Europe, especially if the Gulf Stream gets interrupted by, say, a big tongue of ice flows out of Canada and blocks the Gulf Stream from flowing over to Europe.
When was the last time we had that kind of glacial advance? 10,000 years ago in the United States? When was it?
Oh, the last big one was 150,000 years ago, but there were minor ones that were in the 10 to 20,000 years in the past. If you look at the charts, you see you'll see the whole thing going up, but you see dips as it's going up, and the dips are glaciation periods, short-term glaciation periods.
So I've moved recently, and there's a museum here on an island in the Chesapeake Bay, and one of the displays is a mastodon teeth and a spearhead that they've dated from about 22,000 years ago, and the spear was in the mastodon, right? But the spear has all of the design elements of a European heritage, not Asiatic. Meaning, 22,000 years ago, they believe someone came across an ice bridge from Europe to that part of the world, which is now Chesapeake Bay. Here's the most interesting thing. It was in a bog. That's where the animal was killed. And that bog is now under 330 feet of water. The sea has risen 330 feet since 22,000 years ago. Not, you know,
the land is sunk, but
the land is a combination thereof. But I would think that the sea rising would rise faster than the land sinking. But I mean, literally all of this land is now submerged.
Well, consider the fact that there was lots of glaciation, lots of glaciers on land. That's water that isn't in the oceans.
Right.
And when it melts, it goes into the oceans and increases the level of the ocean. So it makes perfect sense.
Well, it just seems to me that it's also, we need to put things into perspective. It seems to be nonsense that they're talking about, the impact of the water rising 6 inches, because it looks like it's already done that.
Let me ask you this. You live on Chesapeake Bay. How do you measure the level of the water?
You can. I mean, it goes in, it comes out. I mean, we've got tide. There's a mean low tide level that they try to establish, but I
It goes
couldn't
up,
tell you exactly
goes
where it is.
down from the
It goes
waves,
up and it down. It's just changed by the moon.
and
We get some extremely high tides in September and extremely low tides in other parts of the year. It's always variable.
Yep. So saying that there has been a centimeter increase or decrease in ocean level is really kind of a silly statement, because that's not measurable.
There's a guy out there with a yardstick. I don't know how he does it. It's a great question. So let me ask one other question. So, what should I say to my colleagues about global warming, about climate change? I mean, I'm just sort of, I can come right out and say it. I think it's more about the money than about the science, but that's my opinion, not anybody else's.
Well, actually, there are a lot of people who agree with you. The whole carbon sequestration thing is all about money, billions of dollars. And sequestering carbon is a total, absolute waste of time, except if you have to be a guy doing it and getting paid for it, and then you get rich.
Well, we're getting ready to regulate ourselves into a whole lot of unnecessary expense, in my opinion, but that's a discussion. Maybe I need to change my title from mission oriented to politics today, but in any case, it's always interesting to get your perspective on it, because you've got, the experience of someone who has spent time in the Arctic. What's going on in the Arctic is, I asked you about the sheet ice in the Antarctic. I mean, aren't we having record levels of sea ice right now? And people are trying to dismiss that and say, well, that's part of climate change.
Well,
How can we have more ice if we're getting warmer? I'm having a hard time following the logic on that one.
actually,
Any truth to that?
are you talking about Antarctic or Arctic sea ice?
Antarctic sea ice, I'm reading, the Antarctic sea ice is significantly bigger right now.
It is significantly bigger, and the eastern ice sheet is getting thicker and bigger. The western ice sheet has shrunk a little bit. That's the one over by Palmer Peninsula. But the grand total ice accumulation on the Antarctic continent and in the water is hugely more than it was 10 years ago. And up in the Arctic, where for a while there was some real, genuine sea ice melting, this came about because of something called the Atlantic Oscillation. And it is a combination of current and weather patterns that force warm water northward where it doesn't normally go. And this caused a significant reduction for several years in the Arctic ice pack.
All the polar bears were going to die,
Yeah, during the time that they were talking about polar bears dying, there are 13 species of polar bears. Of those, 12 of them increased their numbers during the time that everybody was wringing their hands. One of the species decreased its numbers, but that came about because the Canadians were penetrating the habitat for that particular type of polar bear, and so they stopped mating as much. There's just no truth to it that the Arctic wildlife has been diminished and that the polar bears are endangered or any of that. That's all made up hogwash.
There's going to be no northern passage open, for sea lanes anytime soon. Then,
well, the guys in Arctic Sting, they certainly traversed it.
Right.
Underwater, under the ice.
Right, but not it's not going to be open sea lanes in the Arctic.
Amundsen actually, the guy who discovered the South Pole, who got there first, he traversed on the surface through the Arctic ice pack and made it all the way to Nome, Alaska. Just at the time when the Norwegian king was crowned, and he sent a telegram from Nome to the king. This was right after Norway had established itself as an independent country from Sweden, and said, "Congratulations, Your Highness, and now one of your subjects has done the Northwest Passage."
How about that? How about that? Well, listen, it's always great to talk with you. You got another book? Is Mac McDowell's got another story coming? Maybe you working
Yes, he
on
does.
something? Okay.
Do you want to hear about it?
I want to hear. Just tease us a little bit.
Okay, back in 1979, there was something called Operation Vela. It turned out that the Israelis and the South Africans had gotten together and detonated a nuclear weapon, and we picked it up with our Vela Hotel satellite. And this was a big deal then. And 10 years later, my guys are going to go there because the South Africans in the story have developed a very small backpack type nuke, and their job is to get in there and kind of stop things from happening.
Here we go, folks.
Vela Redux.
All right. Folks, my guest has been Robert G. Williscroft. He is the author of Operation Whiteout, another in the series for the Mac McDowell mission series. And again, thank you for being my guest. Welcome back. After 114 episodes, you're entering into a very elite group of the two-time guests on the Mission Oriented podcast. So congratulations. I really appreciate you doing this.
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Mission Oriented podcast on the Veteran Crowd Network. I'm going to give a big Army Bravo Zulu shout out to my Navy colleague, Robert Williscroft. Thanks so much for being our guest. And that's a wrap.
Thank you for listening to Mission Oriented. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and you won't miss an episode. To learn more about Mission Oriented and the Veteran Crowd Network, visit us at www.veterancrowdnetwork.com.